This story is not about a ghost, nor an encounter with a creepy stranger. It's not even about a near-death experience or anything like that. As a matter of fact, I was never in danger during the event that I'm going to tell you about. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing memory that I will carry with me until the day I die. I grew up in a small city, the kind of place that you could barely even call a town if it wasn't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was a local movie theater, and it was named after the city. I remember going there when I was very, very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters that we have nowadays, but back then, it was huge for me, and I loved it. So when a few years later, I heard that the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type. Loud music, big crowds with their arms up in the air singing prayers, some even having seizures on stage while the pastor yells through a mic. Every time I walked past the old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregations where the movie posters would have been, and if they were in session, you could even hear them singing from the other side of the street. This group owned the cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building in order to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction, with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college, and my class was very lucky to be involved with the cinema's restoration project, because two of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day we went to visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all around the same age, so we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with the echoes of our drumming and our laughters. That was a little ritual of sorts that everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movies. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because that was a unique opportunity to go into the places that we would never have been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far and no matter how obscure. The first one we found was below the stage. On one of the corners there was a little door, not very visible, probably because it was meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy, with all of those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space, but what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just leftover space behind the boilers, yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it. It may as well have been from a different place altogether. The walls were painted a light color, white I think, but I don't remember it very well because what really got my attention were the drawings on them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees and flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange placing of this room. We could understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during prayers, or maybe the ones of the people who worked there, but the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it. So there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boilers room and continued our tour through the theater, a little puzzled about our finding, but not giving it too much thought. Outside of the auditorium, there were the bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket sale booth, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of the building. With that part done, all that was left was the projection room on the 3rd floor. Behind the tickets booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I could walk several kilometers with no problem and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. And yet, by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted. And I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the 3rd floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one that we were all excited to see. The projector room. The old machine was so big that it was actually still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history, and we were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave. But there, we saw it again. There was a train in this one, instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it in big, colorful letters. Something about Christ, but I can't remember it well. The drawings were a bit old. Paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colors were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to the realization of what that place really was. And the one behind the boilers was probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated the room was, literally the furthest away you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs and imagined what it would have been like to a child to walk all the way up, only to end up in that room, the room with the colorful train in the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions, and I knew they were thinking the same. We never visited the theater again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months, and we never talked about these 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the pedo priest is practically a cliche. But this is the kind of thing that you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even another country. You never imagine it can happen in the very same town you live, the place where you grew up, in the very same building where you once watched a Pokemon movie when you were 7 years old. I should mention that I previously lived in a tiny town, but went to school in a considerably larger city. I never had a reason or the nerve to go out in the city on my own, so when my 2 friends wanted to hang around town, I was nervous, to say the least. However, I thought, what the hell, I'll be with them. We had a blast for a couple of hours after school, with some small scary incidents along the way, including walking through a store full of expensive statues and gemstones with a massive backpack protruding from my back, and the original restaurant we wanted to go to was closed, forcing us to Subway. However, as it got dark, we all knew we had to go home, so we all enjoyed one last store and went on our separate ways. I waited outside the store, alone in the dark, not terribly afraid. Yet. I had told my mother where to find me, but she's hopeless with directions, so I expected to be hanging around for a while. I noticed a news camera stationed outside the store, which made me feel even safer. But about 10 minutes into the wait, I was approached by two men. My memory is fuzzy due to how freaked out I was, but this is what I remember. One of the men walked up to me, asking if I knew where a certain place was. I don't remember what they were looking for, but I had no idea where that was, so I shook my head. I was already nervous. I'm a paranoid person on the best of days, and this was not turning out to be the best of days. "Oh, come on," one man coaxed. The other man chimed in. "Listen, we'll give you a bag of jewelry if you help us." Now, I was genuinely freaking out. I glanced around and noticed the news camera and stepped a little closer to the line of sight of the lens. "Listen," I stammered, trying really hard not to stammer or show how freaked I was. "I think it's that way, and I don't need anything." I said this while pointing in a random direction. They glanced in the direction of my finger and then back at me. "Can you show us? Again, we got a bag of jewelry." I felt as if my heart leaped up in my throat. "No, thank you. My mom is coming to get me," I declined, as calmly as I could. They stared at me for a few seconds, and then they nodded, thanking me and heading off in the direction I had pointed at. I kept well in the line of sight of the news camera until my mother picked me up. I didn't fully relax for a full week. I have absolutely no idea why they were so eager to give me that bag of jewelry. My first thought was that they stole it and wanted to throw the police off their trail by handing some of it to me. The second was that they were trying to lure me away with the jewelry. Either way, if that was their goal, it wouldn't have ended well for me. No one believed me, but I didn't expect them to, really. I have never felt comfortable in the city, alone, in the dark, ever since. Even though it's been 2 years, and I now live in a decently sized city for college. My cousins live in North Dakota, and I spent the winter break there, freshman year in college. We were at her friend's house one night, drinking in her basement with some other girls, and it was really late, like 3 a.m. I was falling asleep, so I decided to walk home. They live in a desolate area, with lots of snow, and it gets really cold, especially at night. But the houses weren't too far apart, and when the moon is out, it seems to be light out. The path we always take is straight behind the house, through some wooded areas and then more open land. As I was shuffling home through the snow, with my head down, I look up, and to the left of me, probably like 75 yards away, is another figure, walking in the opposite direction. I saw him a split second before he saw me, and when he did, he kind of jerked his shoulders up a little, obviously startled at the sight of me. I laughed out loud for some reason, just from the shock or something, and gave him a little wave, like, "Oh, you startled me, haha, sorry," kind of thing. He just stood there and stared at me. I thought he was going to say something for a second, and so I stopped too, just looking at him. He had a full-face ski mask on, and I could tell he was a dude, 'cause he was really tall. But he didn't say anything, so for what felt like forever, it's just me and some stranger in a ski mask, looking at each other in the desolate woods. In the middle of winter, at 3 a.m., a huge chill went up my spine, and something told me I needed to get the hell out of there, fast. I turned around and started walking as fast as I could. I have never been that scared in my life. I was a little drunk, stoned, and very paranoid. I imagined myself walking home from the opposite perspective, the man running up from behind me with an axe. So I literally just screamed and started sprinting as fast as I could all the way home, thinking that this guy could easily follow my tracks in the snow and I'm gonna get murdered. Luckily, I didn't, but I don't think I'll be visiting my cousins again anytime soon. I live in an old apartment building. I've been here for about 2 years, and my roommate and I have had very few scary experiences so far. Except for this one that happened last summer. It was around 4 in the morning when we were woken from a dead sleep by the fire alarms going off throughout our entire 4-story apartment building. Seeing as this place is occupied mostly by seniors, we figured someone had left a pot on the stove again. I grumbled and blindly grabbed for a blanket. Last time we had a false alarm, I was left shivering and barefoot on the sidewalk, waiting for the fire department, and I wasn't about to let that happen again. My roommate and I put on our shoes. I grabbed my phone and keys, and we poked our head out into the hallway. Nothing seemed off. The hall was empty. No one else had come out of their apartment yet. Reluctantly, my roommate and I walked down the hall towards the lobby. We figured our neighbors would soon follow suit. It was only when we went through the lobby and out the front door that we realized something was actually wrong. A handful of people who had already come out of the building were running and shouting about how the building was actually on fire this time. We followed them around to the side of the building as more and more people fled in their pajamas. And to our horror, we saw an apartment on the top floor belching out flames. People were frantic, searching for water, a ladder, anything. Someone remarked that there was a lady who lived in that apartment who had mobility issues and she needed to be rescued. My roommate was quite disturbed by the whole scene, so we decided to go back to the front of the building, away from the fire. On our way, we saw a guy jump off his balcony to the ground. He rolled when he landed, but I think it still really hurt, judging from how he sat on the grass and groaned for a while. He was lucky to only be on the 2nd floor. There was chaos, yelling and screaming, and an odd mix of panic and disinterest, especially among the senior citizens who didn't want to leave the building because using the stairs was so difficult. The fire department arrived much quicker than they ever had before, seeing as this was a real emergency. And it wasn't long before elderly ladies in nightgowns were being rescued via ladders and wheeled off to the hospital next door. At one point, the man who lived below the apartment on fire had a screaming episode at one of the landlords. By the time the fire apartment got everything under control, it was around 6 or 7 a.m. The sun was up, and people were beginning their morning commute. The fire department had blocked off our whole street, which must have been a pain. And the entire population of my building sat on the curb in pajamas and blankets. Little kids, old people, broke college students, the works. The community really pulled together that morning. The public bus service gave us a couple of buses to sit and warm up in, instead of standing around on the chilly sidewalk. Paramedics handed out blankets and assessed injuries, and the people in the surrounding houses were kind enough to bring us water and snacks. One lady even brought a serving tray with mugs of tea from her own kitchen and offered it to anyone she could find. My mum came down to rescue my roommate and I, even though she lived an hour outside of town and hadn't even showered yet. She brought us breakfast and a change of clothes, as we didn't know when we'd be allowed back into the building. The most disturbing details of what had just taken place that morning came to us as we were waiting on the bus. Everyone was talking about the fire, of course, but one man had a particularly horrifying detail to add. He'd heard through the grapevine that the lady whose apartment caught fire never made it out of the building. Sadly, we suspected as much with her mobility issues and all. But there was more. The firefighters apparently found her in the hall. She had made it out of her apartment, but couldn't escape the smoke. Whether she died from smoke inhalation or from burns, we aren't sure. But one thing that the man said that still sticks with me is that somebody said that as they stood outside and watched the flames, they heard the woman screaming, "Help me, I'm burning." I've always been afraid of burning to death, and the idea that my neighbor may have had such a horrifying end is deeply disturbing. I know the man who lived below her heard her screaming. He wouldn't stop talking about it. I think he ended up with a form of PTSD from this event, and I don't blame him. We were all brought to a community center where the fire department and emergency response volunteers helped bring some clarity to the situation and told us what to expect. Everyone was very kind and sympathetic to us. Whatever we needed, they provided for us. I think all of that is pretty standard procedure, but still, I was extremely thankful to the kindness of the volunteers, firefighters, paramedics, and Good Samaritans. It was pretty surreal to be in a situation like that. We had almost nothing on us. My roommate hadn't thought to grab her phone, so she had to borrow mine to let her family know that she was okay. We had no money, no ID, none of the essentials, and we had no idea how long we would be homeless. I hadn't been so happy to have my mom with me in a long time. I felt like a scared little girl, even if I didn't show it. We were lucky. The fire happened on the opposite side of the building from us. Our unit was totally unaffected, and we were some of the few allowed back into our apartments that same day. The building stunk of smoke for weeks. Even though the fire took place on the 4th floor in a single apartment, the damage was extensive. Even on the ground floor, the walls were blackened with ash. When they attempted to start fixing up the building, they found asbestos in the walls. A few people were forced to move out of their apartments, and we're talking people who had lived there for around 30 years. I remember the night we were allowed back into our apartment, I wanted to box up my most important possessions and keep them in my car, as if I thought that the building was going to catch fire again. My home didn't feel safe anymore, and it wouldn't for several weeks. It would take a long time for us to hear anything about what caused the fire. Last I heard, a space heater was to blame, but I don't know for sure. In the days that followed, the fire was featured on the front page of the local paper. The family that lived just down the hall from us were featured in the picture. The article spelled out details that I had already heard. It labeled the guy that lived below the fire as a hero for attempting to save the lady upstairs. It was a valiant effort, but there was nothing he could have done without endangering himself. I feel sorry for him, and I often wonder if the guilt keeps him up at night. Sometimes I think about the lady who passed away in this building. I listen to a lot of ghost stories, so I wonder if her spirit haunts this place. Her sudden and horrifying death would be the sort of thing to make a ghost linger on Earth, wouldn't it? So many things left unfinished. Regardless, I hope she's at peace, and I hope that my neighbors have been able to find some semblance of peace as well. 4 months later, we've regained a sense of normalcy. Things are back to how they were before, if you ignore the orange tarps around the side of the exterior, the restoration vans that come and go every day, and the security guards stationed in the lobby. The damaged wing is still closed while they try and sort out the asbestos situation, but for those of us who live on the other end of the building, things are relatively normal. I hope they stay that way.